Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Siege of Vrax, the third episode, where we're finally going to get into some real action with the opening battles of the Siege of Vrax. The Imperium's response has been made absolutely manifest, and the Death Corps of Krieg has arrived on Vrax in considerable strength. The first thing they would do was to land on the planet, as we talked about previously, and fortify a small area, upon which they would build a series of improvised starports. These would be nothing like the massive industrial complexes of a proper starport, but for now it would serve the Death Corps' need in establishing a base of logistics and then further front lines from which the attack upon Vrax's outer defences could be launched. Luckily for the poor sods in the Death Corps, they were not expected to build all of it. The Adeptus Administratum had brought along with them a 1,000,000-man strong labour corps, whose primary and first duty was the construction of the improvised starport, whilst under the protection of the Death Corps of Krieg. Once this was done, the secondary task was the construction of massive rail yards, which would then be used by gargantuan Adeptus Mechanicus trains to haul the vast quantities of ammunitions and other supplies needed up to the forward lines. And speaking of said lines, let's have a look at how the 88th Siege Army had been deployed. Obviously, since their objective was to lay siege to Vrax, their deployment plan was primarily influenced by the location and strength of the Vraxian defences. And they were excessive, would perhaps be the correct word. Over Vrax's many-year history, their fortifications had spread and spread and spread, until finally, this battlefield would cover some 5,000 square kilometers. And primarily, the Vraxian defenses were organized into 3 defensive lines: the first and outer defensive line, the middle and inner defensive line, and finally, the third inner defensive line, the Red Line, which included the Vraxian citadel itself, where the apostate cardinal was currently residing. Once the 88th Siege Army was entrenched outside this line, the primary citadel would be within range of their heavy artillery, and at that point, there would be very little hope of Vrax ever resisting the Imperium's advance. The only question then was how to actually reach said third and final Red Line. And the Imperium was sadly somewhat limited in their options. They could not flank around to the south, as that terrain was covered in deep, damn near unbridgeable gorges, and was, for all intents and purposes, untraversable by the 88th Siege Army. Now, there was one area that might facilitate a large-scale landing operation that was also defended by the 2nd Defensive Line. Krieg High Command briefly considered landing a force here and making a go for the 2nd line, therefore potentially circumventing the 1st line of defenses, but this was on a fairly small peninsula, surrounded by deep canyons on practically all sides. Any large-scale landing here would have to be continuously supported and supplied directly from orbit, without the benefit of a logistical line or supply depots. This would severely limit the size of the force that could be dropped on this smaller peninsula. This in return meant that their attack upon the 2nd defensive line would be considerably weaker, and to make things even worse, seeing as they would be almost completely surrounded by impassable terrain, it would be virtually impossible for the rest of the 88th Siege Army to send any aid if this formation was put under threat. Meanwhile, the Vraxians could easily transport vast quantities of troops from any of the other defensive zones. It was quickly decided that the risks of launching an attack from this direction were simply too great in comparison to the potential benefits. And since an all-out strike against the Vraxian starport to the east had been considered and also rejected, that meant that options for fanciful maneuvering had more or less been exhausted. Luckily, this wasn't really considered to be all that much of a bad thing as far as the Death Corps was concerned. Instead, they had formulated a simple yet reliable plan. First and foremost, the Vraxian defenses were to be encircled by the 88th Siege Army as far as the terrain allowed. Then, once the encirclement was established, the Siege Army would begin localized offensives whilst continuously threatening the entirety of the Vraxian front line. The logic here was quite simple. The 88th Siege Army knew that in all due likelihood they would be outnumbering the defenders of Vrax, which they still assumed to consist of a few 100,000, maybe 1 or 2 million at the absolute most. However, the Siege Army had one massive advantage. They were on the offensive. They could simply encircle the Vraxian defenses, create their own defensive lines, and threaten any and all points along the Vraxian defenses. This meant that the Vraxians had to defend every single location simultaneously, spreading their fairly limited manpower resources across a vast area. Meanwhile, the Imperial Guard could easily afford to match the Vraxian defenders on the defensive, whilst also gathering up vastly superior forces for localized breakthroughs. And once the breakthrough was achieved, the 88th Siege Army's assault corps would begin pouring through the gap. And once this process had begun, it was expected that the only choice open to the Vraxian defenders would be to fall back from what remained of their first defensive line to attempt to reinforce the second. A failure to initiate such a withdrawal would leave the Vraxian defenders facing enemies to their front, to their flank, and to their rear, unquestionably sealing their fate and any possibility of further withdrawal. In conventional military thinking, there would also be a second option for the defenders, and that would be a large-scale localized counterattack utilizing any and all reserves of a motorized, mechanized, or tank variety, including any and all super heavy weapons that the defenders might be in possession of. The goal of this operation would be to attack, disrupt, and potentially even destroy the Imperial Spearhead, with the goal of then carrying on past the Assault Corps into the breach and the defensive line, clearing out any remaining Imperial Guard elements within the breach, resealing it, and potentially even carrying out a rapid riposte into the Imperial rear lines. Such a counterattack, if carried out expertly and with the correct timing, could potentially be absolutely devastating, since the Imperial Siege Army would in all due likelihood be in the process of picking up their own heavy weapons, reserves, and logistical elements, and begin moving them forwards to what was once the enemy's forward lines, so that they could start digging in again and beginning the siege of the second defensive line. If the enemy counterattack catches these troops in the midst of transporting their heavy weaponry, they would essentially be caught flat-footed into the open with virtually nothing in the way of prepared defenses. However, on Vrax, the risk of such a counterattack was considered to be very, very low, virtually entirely negligible in fact, since the majority of the defenders would at best be ex-PDF troops. And the Death Corps High Command did not believe that such troops had the training, experience, or command structure necessary to organize such an endeavor. At worst, they reckoned they might be faced with smaller, localized, regimental-sized counterattacks, which a full Krieg Assault Corps should have no problems crushing beneath their tracks. And so, with that worry out of the way, the plan itself was quite simple. Firstly, the 88th Siege Army would deploy in a semi-encirclement of the outer defensive line. This line was to be overrun quickly. Therefore, large-scale artillery bombardments would be aimed at what they assumed to be weak points in the line, and then the Krieg soldiers would simply be hurled at these weak points until they finally gave way, after which the assault corps would swiftly punch through the weakened breaches and begin their advance upon the second line of defenses. This offensive would then also lead to the collapse of the outer line, which in turn would allow the 88th Siege Army to move forwards and initiate a proper encirclement of Vrax's second line. This advance would also cut 2 of the 3 primary connections leading from the Vraxian starport to the Vraxian citadel. The defenders were not expected to receive any form of reinforcement off-world. The Imperial Navy was going to make sure of that, but this could allow the 88th Siege Army to begin an offensive against the starport itself, possibly taking it over, or at the very least leaving it as nothing more than a burning ruin. This was, however, very much so a secondary, if not perhaps even a tertiary objective, since at this point the 88th Siege Army would be fully supplied from their own improvised starports. The capture of the full industrialized Vraxian starport would be a nice bonus, but it was not necessary, and considering the inherent defensibility of said installation, that might be for the best. The starport was located on the other side of a series of massive canyons, spanned by prefabricated bridges, and the capture of said installation would literally require the Death Corps to march across aforementioned bridges with practically nothing in the way of cover for up to several kilometers. And whilst the Death Corps never shirks from doing what must be done, there is a difference between sacrifice and suicide. Once the siege army was entrenched along the second line, they could then begin to take their time. The numerical advantage they had already enjoyed at the first line would now have been considerably increased by the fact that the front line had been yet further shortened, allowing the 88th Siege Army to concentrate even more guns, even more manpower, and even more tanks in an even smaller area. And this was where the majority of the 12-year projected period of the siege would take place, as the 88th Siege Army simply pounded every single last defensive fortification into the ground, one by one, line by line, bunker by bunker, trench by trench, until nothing was left standing. And after literally years of heavy bombardment and probing attacks, the weakest points along the lines would have been identified, and a slow, grinding advance would then begin, with the aim of completely destroying the second defensive line. This offensive operation was expected to be conducted with minimal in the way of casualties due to the amount of time the 88th Siege Army expected to have to reduce the enemy's defenses. And when they finally crumbled, the last, final part of the operation could begin. The 88th Siege Army would advance up until the very innermost defenses, the curtain walls of the keep itself. At this point, the Vraxian citadel and all remaining traitor forces on Vrax would be within range of the heavy Krieg artillery, and at this point, there really wasn't much left for the defenders to do. They would be outnumbered, penned into a tiny comparative area, under constant artillery bombardment from all directions without the ability to move up reserves, reinforcements, supply, or anything else that really mattered. When finally encamped outside the last line of defense, the war was as good as over. Another year, maybe two, of consistent artillery bombardment and the occasional infantry probing attack to discover the remaining weak points in the enemy's defenses, and then these could be subsequently overrun by massed formations of Imperial armor. It certainly wasn't the most subtle, or the most nuanced, or the most complex plan ever devised by Imperial Guard commanders, but it didn't have to be. The Death Corps sat with all of the advantages. They had the initiative, they had the manpower, they had the material, and all they needed to do was grind away at a static enemy in known defensive positions until there was nothing more to grind away at. Exactly the kind of fight that the Death Corps was created for. So, it was all a done deal then. All that's left now is to wait for the inevitable outcome. Or was it? I guess we'll see. Because as the old saying goes, even a journey of 1,000,000 miles starts with a single step. And in this case, the first step was already well underway. The establishment of the vast logistical network required to support the 88th Siege Army in the field. This process was to take a full year, and when it was finally completed, the initial offensive operations could begin. The first step was, of course, for the Krieg regiments to begin establishing their own front line, a safe forward base of operation from which they could launch offensive operations and fall back as needed. And the first step in doing this was to divide the total front line up amongst the available corps. In this case, specifically the Line Corps, with the 34th Corps being tasked with advancing upon the Vraxian defences from the south across the plains of Saramita, the 12th Corps advancing across the Van Meeslands wastes, the 30th Corps advancing towards the Sorin Depression, and finally the 1st Corps swinging around to the north, advancing towards the Chalia Plateau, and beginning an attack against the Vraxian northern defences, which were partially incomplete. Although, mind you, I said they started their advance at this point, and whilst that is technically true, this first offensive was to be relatively bloodless. The Krieg heavy artillery was, of course, to play their own special music of destruction, but the infantry was not expected to advance into combat on this first offensive operation. Rather, their job was to advance slowly and steadily into the area that had been getting plastered by the artillery. Once again, Krieg is fond of sacrifice, not suicide. The intention of this first heavy walking barrage was to provide the Krieg troopers with plenty of makeshift cover in the form of shell holes. Once the Krieg troopers had reached this area, they would then begin moving forward slowly until they came under heavy and concentrated fire. Then they would begin digging in and preparing the foundation for their own defensive line. On the first night, this defensive line would consist of simple foxholes, 2 men per hole. Then, over the next few days, they would begin expanding this simple defensive line, with each man occupying the foxhole, digging in opposite directions to connect their foxhole to the foxholes next to them. Over the course of just a day or two, what started out as a large collection of individual shelters will have evolved into a makeshift front line. At this point, heavy weapons will be brought forward and put into positions. Additionally, light engineering vehicles might also be moved forward to help expand the front line and create further dugouts, reinforced embankments, and shelters. When these operations are complete, the front line is considered to be relatively secure against any kind of rapid push by the enemy. This then makes it safe enough to begin work on the second front line. This will be the main series of defences to ensure that the enemy cannot break out of the encirclement even with a coordinated effort, and as such it will be considerably more ambitious. This is also the reason why this line is created second, as it will require a fair bit of time to create and will also need quite a bit of specialist equipment that needs protecting from enemy heavy weapons fire and the occasional raid. Once this line is complete, it will